She had no family left until the Mafia boss said, "Then you'll take my name." The sound was what broke through the numbness, the heavy, wet thud of dirt hitting cheap pine. Ilara stood motionless, the gray November sky weeping a cold drizzle that plastered strands of dark hair to her hollow cheeks. She was 26 years old, and she was burying the last person on earth who shared her blood. The priest, a man she didn't know, mumbled the last rites for a person he'd never met. Leo, her brother. Her whirlwind of chaos, her burden, her only friend, gone, not in a blaze of glory, not in a tragic accident, but from a needle in a filthy room 3 blocks from the apartment they'd shared. An overdose, a quiet, pathetic end to a loud, messy life. When the casket was fully lowered, the priest glanced at her, his expression professionally somber. "My condolences, child." Ilara just nodded. There were no other mourners. No aunts, no uncles, no grandparents. Just her, the priest, and 2 groundskeepers leaning on their shovels, waiting to finish the job. She was an island, and the tide had finally washed away the last connecting strip of land. She was, in the truest sense of the word, alone. She didn't cry. The grief was too vast, too cold. It had frozen her from the inside out. She stayed until the last shovel of dirt was patted down, then turned and walked out of the cemetery, her shoes squelching in the mud. The apartment was suffocatingly silent. It smelled like Leo, stale cigarettes, old beer, and the faint, sweet rot of things left undone. For 3 days, she moved through the small space like a ghost, cleaning, sorting, bagging. It was in the back of his closet, shoved inside a worn-out sneaker, that she found the envelope. It wasn't a bank envelope. It was cheap, white, and had Leo scribbled on the front. Inside, a single page of printer paper, folded. The words were blunt, misspelled, and terrifying. It was a loan agreement, or a crude version of one. A signature she recognized as her brother's desperation was scrawled at the bottom. The amount made the air leave her lungs. $50,000. The lender was listed only as A.G. Holdings. There was a phone number and a final, chilling sentence. Payment due on the 1st. No exceptions. We know where you live. The 1st, that was 2 days from now. A cold, sharp panic, unlike the dull ache of grief, pierced through Ilara. 50,000. Leo had been clean, or so he'd sworn. He'd been working, or so he'd said. It was all lies, another tower of lies, and he'd left her at the bottom to be crushed by it. Her job was a joke against this sum. She was a server at the Sure Shot, a rundown diner on the edge of the district where the chrome was peeling and the coffee tasted like burnt tires. She worked 8-hour shifts, her feet aching. Her smile stapled on for men who left a $1 tip and tried to grab her hand. She cleared maybe $300 a week, after taxes. That wasn't enough to cover the interest, let alone the principal. She was too proud to ask for help. And who would she ask? The few friends she had were just as broke as she was. Other servers and line cooks swimming in their own small debts. The calls started the next day. "Ilara," a voice like gravel and smoke rasped over the line. She didn't ask how he got her number. "Your brother left a tab, a big one." I can't," she whispered, her hand shaking. "I don't have it." "Not our problem, sweetheart." The voice chuckled. It was a sound entirely devoid of humor. Leo's debt didn't die with him. It just transferred. "We'll be seeing you." He hung up. The next day, 2 men came into the diner. They weren't the usual clientele of tired truckers and hungover construction workers. They wore cheap suits that looked too tight, their eyes hard and flat. They sat in her section, at a cracked vinyl booth in the back. "Coffee," the bulky one said. She brought it, her hands trembling so hard the cup rattled in the saucer. They didn't talk, they just sat, for an hour. They watched every table she served, every order she took, every time she wiped down the counter. Their presence was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. When they finally left, they dropped $2 on the table for the coffee, a message, "We know where you work." She started taking the long way home, her keys clutched between her fingers like a weapon. She stopped answering her phone, But the fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach that never went away. She was being stalked, and there was nowhere to run. It happened 3 nights later. It was late, past midnight, and she was taking the trash out after her closing shift. The alley behind the Sure Shot smelled of sour milk, wet cardboard, and the city's perpetual grime. She tossed the heavy black bag into the dumpster and turned, fumbling in her apron for her keys. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. "We missed you! Alara!" The gravelly voice from the phone whispered in her ear. His breath was hot, smelling of whiskey. Another man, the bulky one from the diner, grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her back. He slammed her against the brick wall. The impact knocked the wind from her. Stars exploded behind her eyes. "You think you can just ignore us?" Gravel voice snarled, ripping the keys from her hand. "Your brother left a debt. You're going to pay it, one way or another." He pressed his face close to hers, and she squeezed her eyes shut. Pure, primal terror flooding her veins. She kicked, bucked, tried to bite the hand over her mouth, but they were too strong. "We're going to start with a down payment right now." The bulky one grunted, his hand fumbling at the buttons of her uniform. Suddenly, the alley was flooded with light, high-intensity headlights so bright they burned. A deep, throaty engine rumbled, the sound vibrating in Alara's chest. The 2 men froze, squinting into the glare. A vehicle, a massive black SUV, sat at the mouth of the alley. It was matte black, with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian. It was the kind of vehicle that cost more than her entire apartment building, a silent, menacing predator. It just sat there, idling. "Crap," Gravel voice whispered, his grip loosening on her. "It's him." The bulky one let go of her arms entirely, taking a step back. "We didn't know she was... The back window of the SUV lowered with a faint electronic hum. Alara, gasping for air and sliding down the slick wall, couldn't see the man inside, just a silhouette, a presence. A large hand emerged. It wore a heavy gold ring on its pinky finger. The hand didn't wave, it didn't point, it just gestured. A slight, dismissive flick of the wrist. The 2 loan sharks scrambled. They didn't just walk away, they ran, vanishing into the darkness on the other side of the alley like rats. Alara was left on the ground, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold. She was hyperventilating, the adrenaline crashing, leaving her sick and weak. The SUV's engine rumbled, but it didn't move. A different door opened, the driver's side. A man built like a refrigerator in a black suit got out. He walked toward her, his footsteps measured and heavy. He didn't offer a hand. "Mister, Russo wants you seen home," and the man said. His voice was flat. Mister, Russo?" Alara stammered, pulling her torn uniform together. "He owns this block, including the diner." The driver's eyes were as dead as the diner's neon sign. "Get in the car. You're not safe." She was too shaken to argue, too terrified to do anything but obey. The ride home was 5 blocks of absolute, terrifying silence. The inside of the SUV smelled like rich leather and cold steel. She sat on the edge of the seat, rigid. The man in the back, Mr. Russo, never spoke. She never saw his face. The driver walked her to her apartment door and waited until she was inside. "Do not go back to the diner," he ordered, and left. Alara leaned against the closed door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't understand. He hadn't saved her. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He had exterminated a pest. He had cleared his property. She was just the trash he was cleaning up. She tried to go on. She called the diner the next day, claiming she was sick. The silence in her apartment, once a comfort, was now a threat. Every creak in the hallway made her jump. She huddled on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, unable to eat, the next evening. She forced herself to go to the bodega on the corner for milk and bread. She couldn't hide forever. She had to think, to make a plan. When she returned, she knew something was wrong before she even reached the door. It was slightly ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, kicked in. Her blood ran cold. "No. Please. No." She pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The apartment was destroyed. The few things of value she and Leo had owned were shattered. The cushions on the couch were slashed, stuffing pulled out. The photos of her and Leo as kids were torn from the wall, the glass crunching under her feet. They had been thorough. They had been angry. And on the small kitchen counter, stark against the chipped laminate, was a dead gray dove. Its neck was broken, its head lolling at an unnatural angle. It was a violation. A message so profound it stole her breath. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power. This was to show her that the man in the SUV couldn't protect her. Ilara backed away slowly, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream building in her throat. She hit the wall, her eyes fixed on the bird. A shadow filled the broken doorway. She flinched, terror seizing her. But it wasn't the men from the alley. This man was tall, dressed in a black suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed molded to him. He was not old. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair swept back from a face that looked carved from granite. His eyes, so dark they were almost black, took in the room in a single, cold sweep. They lingered on the bird, then moved to her. It was him, Dante Russo. He stepped into the apartment, crunching over the broken glass as if it wasn't there. He radiated a power that sucked the air from the room, a cold, controlled stillness that was more terrifying than any shouting. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, quiet rumble that vibrated with contained rage. I put you in a car. I had my men watch this building. Why is this the first I am hearing about this? He gestured to the dead bird, his expression one of deep, chilling displeasure. I don't know, Ilara whispered, shaking her head. I just got home. You don't know, he repeated. It wasn't a question. They came into your home. They destroyed your things. They left this message. And you didn't think to call the number my driver gave you? The accusation in his tone, the cold fury. It snapped something in her. The terror was momentarily eclipsed by a flash of her own desperate anger. Call you? Why? She spat, her voice trembling. So you can own me, too? I'm not one of your properties. I don't want your help. He moved closer, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. He was imposing, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and something sharp. Like cold metal? You think this is about want? He said. No. His voice dropping even lower. This has nothing to do with what you want. This is about what is... Those animals did this to send a message. Not to you. To me. They put their hands on something that was on my property. I'm not your property, she cried, tears of fear and frustration finally breaking free, streaming down her face. He looked at her, his dark eyes assessing, and his expression was flat. Final. You are now... The words hit her harder than the brick wall. The finality of it, the truth of it, the funeral, the debt, the attack, the bird, the man standing in her ruined life. She was trapped. She was so tired. The pride that had kept her standing, the stubbornness that had defined her, it all just shattered. A sob, ugly and raw, tore itself from her chest. It was for Leo. It was for her stolen safety. It was for the terrifying, overwhelming realization that she was completely, utterly at the mercy of forces she couldn't fight. She slid down the wall, curling into herself, burying her face in her knees as the grief and terror she'd been holding back finally consumed her. There was a long silence in the room, broken only by her ragged, desperate breathing. She felt him move, felt the air shift. When she dared to look up through her tears, he was crouched in front of her. He was too close, his presence overwhelming. He didn't touch her, he just watched her, his expression unreadable. That cold fury was gone, replaced by something else. A flicker of dark curiosity, an assessment. They made a mistake, he said, his voice a quiet rumble. Touching you was a mistake. They won't make it again. He stood, a towering shadow against the dim light of the hallway. He extended his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, the heavy gold ring catching the light. Get up! She shook her head, unable to move. I said, get up. His voice was softer, but it was not a request. It was an order wrapped in steel. He waited. Slowly, painfully, she took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and engulfed her own. He pulled her to her feet easily, as if she weighed nothing. "You're done here," he said. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "This is all I have." "No," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "It's not." He didn't let go of her hand. "You have me. You're not going to face any of this alone again." The private elevator opened directly into the apartment, and Alara felt like she had been dropped onto another planet. It wasn't an apartment. It was a cavern of glass and steel, 2 stories high, with a wall of windows overlooking the entire city. The lights below glittered like a fallen galaxy. The furniture was all sharp angles, black leather and chrome, and there was not a single photograph, not a single book out of place. It was vast, cold, and utterly sterile. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom. "This is temporary," Dante Russo said. His voice echoed slightly in the massive space. Alara stood by the elevator, her arms wrapped around herself. She had nothing, no bag, no clothes, just the torn uniform she was wearing. The image of the dead dove on her counter flashed in her mind, and she felt a wave of nausea. "My men will be outside the door. Marco will be your primary point of contact." He walked to a black marble counter and set down a new phone, still in its box. "This is the only one you'll use. It has my number and only my number." He turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You will not return to the diner. You will not contact anyone from your old life until I handle this. You are not safe." The finality of his words, the sheer, quiet control made her bristle, even through the fear. "And what am I supposed to do? Just sit here? Look at the view? I'm not your prisoner." "You are supposed to be safe," he replied, as if that explained everything. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, and was gone. The heavy silence of the penthouse settled on her. It was louder, more suffocating than the sirens and shouts of her own neighborhood. She was in a gilded cage, perched 50 stories above the world, and she had never felt more trapped. The first few days were a blur of restless agony. A woman, who introduced herself only as Sophia, arrived the next morning with bags of clothes, jeans, sweaters, sleepwear, underwear, all new, all expensive, all in her size. Alara hated them. She hated the softness of the cashmere, the implication that she was a thing to be dressed and kept. She tried to resist his control. She refused to eat the food that was delivered until her stomach ached with a hunger that overruled her pride. She paced the length of the glass windows, a ghost haunting a palace, watching the city live and breathe without her. She hated him. She hated his power, his presumption, his cold, detached protection. But she was also, for the first time in her life, completely safe. No one looked at her with hunger. No one yelled in the hallways. When she slept without one ear open for the sound of a key in a lock. His protective nature, as absolute and uncompromising as a fortress wall, was beginning to affect her, and mixed with that control were rare, unsettling moments of gentleness. He would appear late at night, letting himself in with a key, and find her asleep on the couch, the television mumbling. She would wake with a start, her heart in her throat, only to see him standing there, watching her. He wouldn't apologize for waking her. He would just walk to the kitchen, pour 2 glasses of water, and hand one to her. "You should be in bed," he'd say, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "I don't like the bedroom," she'd whisper, meaning, "I don't like being this far from the only exit." He would just nod, sit in the armchair across from her, and say nothing. He would just exist, a silent, imposing guardian. One night, he was watching her as she stared out the window, her reflection a pale, thin specter against the city lights. She looked hopelessly lost, but her jaw was set in that stubborn, defiant line he was beginning to recognize. He saw her strength, the steel spine holding up the quiet sadness. He saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. It triggered something in him, A memory sharp as broken glass. He was 10 years old, huddled in a freezing room in a part of the city he'd since burned to the ground. His mother was by the window, her face a map of purple and yellow bruises, watching the snow fall. She was waiting for a man who would only bring more pain. Dante, small and furious, had watched her, a vow hardening in his chest, a vow that he would never be that helpless, and that no one under his protection would ever be that helpless again. He saw his mother's shadow in Alara's posture. He clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking. This was different. He was not a helpless boy, and those animals who had touched her, who had put that look in her eyes, would learn the difference. The tension in the apartment grew thick, a silent, thrumming wire between them. It snapped one night, deep into the second week. Alara woke up screaming, the sound tearing from her throat. She was back in the alley, the smell of whiskey and wet brick in her nose, the bulky man's hands on her uniform, ripping. She scrambled out of the massive bed, tangling herself in the high thread count sheets, and fell, crab-walking backward until she hit the wall. The bedroom door flew open. Dante was there, framed in the light from the hall. He wore only a pair of black sweatpants, his chest and arms bare, defined. He was awake instantly, his eyes sweeping the room for a threat. "What is it?" His voice was rough, alert. Alara couldn't speak. She was hyperventilating, her entire body shaking in the grip of the terror. He was here. Dante saw her, curled against the wall, her eyes wide with a fear that was not for him, but from something else. He stopped, his posture easing from threat to control. "You're safe," he said, his voice flat. "No one is here. You're in the penthouse." He took a step, and she flinched. He stopped again. He was visibly, profoundly awkward. He didn't know how to handle. He couldn't shoot a nightmare. He couldn't intimidate a memory. "Breathe, Alara." She shook her head, tears streaming. I can't. He let out a short, frustrated sigh. He left the room. She thought he was leaving her, a fresh wave of despair washing over her, but he returned a moment later with a glass of water. "Drink." She couldn't hold it. Her hands were shaking too badly. With a low curse, he knelt, holding the glass to her lips himself. She took a few sips, the cold water a shock. He steered her, not by the arm, but with a hand on her back, out of the bedroom and into the living room. "You're not going back to sleep like this." He sat her on the couch. She immediately curled into the far corner, pulling her knees to her chest. He sat on the opposite end, stiff as a board, watching her. The silence stretched, filled only by her ragged, hiccuping breaths. She started to shake again, a deep, bone-chilling tremor. Dante watched her for a long, charged minute. He looked at her like she was a complex problem he couldn't solve. Then he moved. It wasn't gentle. It was a decisive, almost pragmatic action. He slid across the couch, grabbed her, and pulled her against his side, trapping her there with a heavy arm over her shoulders. Alara froze, her muscles rigid. "You're here," he rumbled, his voice next to her ear. "You're fine. Just breathe." The heat from his body was a shock. He was solid, warm, and real. The arm around her wasn't soft. It was heavy, grounding. It was an anchor. She resisted for a moment. Then, with a sob that felt like it tore her in two, she collapsed against him. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and her tears soaked the front of his t-shirt. He remained stiff, a statue of muscle and warmth, but he didn't push her away. He just held her, his hand resting on her shoulder, until her trembling subsided and her breathing finally evened out into the exhausted rhythm of sleep. Dante Russo stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, his expression hard, his arm securely around the woman who had breached his defenses. Alara woke to the gray light of dawn. She was on the couch, tucked under a soft wool blanket. She was alone. Mortification washed over her, hot and sharp. She'd broken down. She'd cried on him, clung to him like a child. She felt weak, pathetic. She scrambled off the couch, her cheeks burning. She would not be weak. She would not be his charity case. She showered, the hot water stinging. When she got out, she looked at the neat piles of clothes Sophia had left. They felt wrong, like a costume. On impulse, she walked into his closet. It was massive, organized by color, dozens of black, gray, and white shirts. She grabbed one, a simple black button-down, and pulled it on. It was huge, hanging to her mid-thighs, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times. But it smelled like him, that clean, sharp scent of expensive soap and something uniquely male. It felt like armor. She marched to the kitchen. It was stocked with more food than she had seen in her life. She found coffee, eggs, bread, butter, the simple, familiar act of cooking, of doing something, settled her nerves. Dante walked in, fully dressed in a crisp black suit, as she was plating the scrambled eggs. He stopped dead. His eyes took her in, the bare legs, the rolled sleeves, his shirt. A flicker of something dark and possessive moved in his gaze. The tension from the night before was still there, but now it was different. It was electric. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "Making breakfast," she said, her chin high. She refused to be embarrassed. "I'm not going to be your prisoner, Dante, and I'm not a guest. If I'm here, I earn my keep." "You don't earn your keep," he said, walking forward. "You stay safe. That's the arrangement." "By doing nothing?" she shot back, turning to face him. "By staring out a window until I go crazy? I'm not a doll you can put on a shelf. I can't just sit. I won't." They stood inches apart, arguing in low, intense voices. He was a wall of muscle and power, but she didn't back down. He looked at the plate of eggs. He looked at her, defiant and small, swallowed by his shirt. A corner of his mouth ticked up, a minuscule, almost invisible movement. "The coffee smells burnt," he said. It was a dismissal, a truce. He sat at the counter. Ilara's heart was hammering, but she turned, poured 2 cups, and slid one in front of him. He picked it up and drank, his dark eyes watching her over the rim. He was softening. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. That evening, she waited up for him. She told herself it was just to clear the air, to prove she wasn't a hysterical mess. But she knew. Deep down, she was waiting just to see him, to feel that strange, grounding presence. He came in late, well past 2 in the morning. He looked exhausted, and he was favoring his left side. "You're still up," he stated. It wasn't a question. He shrugged out of his suit jacket, and she saw the blood. His white dress shirt was soaked in it, a dark crimson stain that started at his cuff and seeped all the way up his forearm. "You're hurt," she gasped, jumping up from the couch. "It's nothing," he said, his voice tight with pain. A meeting ran long. He started to unbutton his cuff, his movements stiff. "Sit down," Ilara ordered. The authority in her own voice surprised them both. Dante looked at her, a flash of annoyance in his eyes, but he was clearly in pain. He sat at the counter, in the same spot he had that morning. "Where is your first aid kit?" "Under the sink." She retrieved it. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. This was purpose. She came back to him, flicking on the bright task light above the counter. "Let me see." He held out his arm. She carefully, gently, rolled up the bloody, saturated sleeve. It was a deep gash, long and clean, from his wrist to his elbow. Not a bullet, a knife. "My God, Dante, this needs stitches," she said, her voice low. "It'll be fine. Just clean it. Don't be stupid." She grabbed a clean cloth and a bottle of antiseptic. "This is going to hurt. Just do it." She pressed the cloth to the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of air, and his entire body went rigid, but he didn't make another sound. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice losing its edge, softening. She worked quickly, her touch surprisingly gentle, cleaning the blood, assessing the damage. The dynamic of the morning was completely flipped. Now he was the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one in control. They were incredibly close. She was standing between his knees, leaning over his arm. Her hair fell forward, brushing his hand. He was completely still, watching her face, not the wound. He watched her intense concentration, the slight frown on her brow, the way she bit her lip. When she was finished cleaning it, she began to bandage it, her fingers light and careful as she wrapped the gauze. "This will have to do," she whispered. "But it needs a doctor." "It's fine," he repeated, his voice rough. She finished, her hands lingering on his arm for just a second too long. She looked up, and her breath caught. His eyes were locked on her. The kitchen was silent, the air thick and heavy. All the tension, the cage, the nightmare, the shirt, the blood, it all coalesced into a single sharp point. He lifted his good hand, the one with the heavy gold ring. He didn't grab her, he just touched her. His knuckles grazed the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was barely there. She leaned into it, a small, involuntary movement. Her eyes fluttered shut. He leaned in. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, his lips brushing hers. It was not the kiss of a brute, it was a search, a question. Alara answered. Her lips softened, parted. Her own hand came up, resting on his broad shoulder, feeling the hard muscle beneath the suit. The kiss deepened, and all the coldness she associated with him melted away. He was warm, and his mouth was tender, passionate. It was the first moment of genuine, human care she had felt in years, and it was devastating. It was raw, emotional, and she felt herself clinging to him, her fingers tightening on his shoulder. Then, just as she was losing herself in the startling, overwhelming softness, he pulled back. His breathing was heavy, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them, almost black. She stared at him, confused. Her lips still parted, her body aching for a contact that was ripped away. "Dante, Go to bed, Alara," he said. His voice was a harsh gravel, all the tenderness gone. "What? What's wrong?" He wouldn't look at her. He was staring at the fresh white bandage on his arm. "You're not ready," he said, the words sharp and final. "Not for this." He stood abruptly, towering over her, his face a cold mask once more. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone under the bright lights, her hands still tingling from the touch of his skin, confused, hurt, and for the first time, wanting more. The silence in the penthouse was thick for 2 full days after the kiss. Alara avoided him, and Dante, for his part, seemed to be avoiding her, leaving before she woke and returning long after she had pretended to go to sleep. The air was charged, the rejection hanging between them like a physical wall. Then, the strangeness began. The oppressive, looming threat that had defined her life for weeks simply evaporated. Marco, the stoic guard who usually just nodded at her, spoke one morning as he delivered a bag of fresh groceries. "You don't need to worry about those men anymore. Miss..." Alara looked up from the counter. "What do you mean?" Marco's expression was flat. "The primary. The one who visited your apartment. He was found this morning. He fell into the river with concrete shoes. He said it like he was reading a weather report. The others have scattered. Mr. Russo's message was received." Alara's stomach turned. Concrete shoes. A cold, brutal finality. The threats stopped. The calls stopped. The fear that had been her constant companion just vanished. And in its place was a new, more complex feeling, a chilling gratitude. Dante had done this. He had murdered a man for her, as casually as he would sign a check. She found herself adjusting. It was strange. The gilded cage became, simply, her home. She learned the rhythms of the place. She discovered Dante's massive library, hidden behind a paneled wall, and lost herself in books. She began cooking in the immaculate kitchen, filling the sterile air with the scent of roasted garlic and fresh bread. She was safe. She was well fed. She was utterly, completely isolated. She also began to see the man behind the protection. One afternoon, he held a meeting in the penthouse, something he never did. He clearly thought she was in the library, but she was in the kitchen, quietly making coffee. 2 men in expensive suits sat across from Dante at his glass dining table. "He's a liability," Dante said, his voice flat, stripped of all warmth. "Dante, he's been with the family for 20 years, one man argued. "He's sloppy," Dante cut back, the words sharp as a razor. "He's skimming from the port. He thinks I don't see. He's not a liability. He's a loose end. You will tie it. Tonight." or I will find someone who can—" The silence that followed was terrifying. Alara watched, frozen, as the men nodded, their faces pale. She saw the boss, the cold, ruthless commander who ordered lives ended and empires shifted. This was the man who had held her during a nightmare. This was the man who had kissed her with such startling tenderness. The contradiction was dizzying. That night, he found her on the terrace. She'd been standing out there for an hour, the cold wind whipping her hair, trying to reconcile the two Dante. He came up behind her, holding 2 glasses of wine. He didn't speak, just handed one to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. "You're afraid of me," he stated. Alara flinched. "I heard you." "This afternoon, tie it." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face in the moonlight. "Is that what you did to the man from my apartment? Did you tie him?" Dante's expression didn't change. He looked out over the city lights. "Yes." The blunt honesty was more shocking than a lie. "Why?" she whispered, turning to face him. "Why am I here, Dante? Am I just another one of your possessions? Something you're protecting because it's yours?" He set his glass down on the ledge, his movements slow, deliberate. "When I was 10, he said, his voice a low rumble. "I watched my father break my mother's arm because her soup was cold. I sat in the corner and did nothing, because I was small, because I was weak." He turned to her, his dark eyes intense. "This world, Alara, the real one, it's built to grind up people like us, people who are alone. It ate your brother. It was seconds away from eating you." He paused, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "You are the first thing I have protected in a very long time that I haven't wanted to own, and it terrifies me." The confession hung in the cold air, the loneliness she had felt her entire life, the isolation of her grief, suddenly had an echo. He was just as alone as she was, but he had built walls of steel and bodies around himself. She had built walls of pride and silence. "I know what it is to be alone," she said, her voice thick. "Until Leo died, I didn't realize. There's a difference between being alone and being left alone." "I know," he said. The tension, the wire that had been stretched taut between them for weeks, finally snapped. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb, rough and calloused, brushed over her cheek. It was the same hand that signed death warrants, the same hand she had bandaged, and it was unbearably gentle. "I pulled away," he murmured, his voice rough. "Not because of you, because of this, because you're not ready, and I am not good." "Don't," she whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart, a steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "Don't tell me what I'm ready for." He leaned down, and this time, the kiss was not hesitant. It was a claiming. It was intense, a release of all the pent-up fear, control, and loneliness. It was not the desperate fumbling of the alley. It was the slow, deliberate exploration of 2 people who had nothing left to lose. His mouth was warm, demanding, yet he held her as if she were made of spun glass. He tasted of expensive wine and a deep masculine hunger that made her knees weak. She kissed him back with a matching desperation, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. He lifted her easily, one arm sweeping under her legs, the other supporting her back. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her mouth never leaving his. He carried her inside, through the dark, cavernous living room, and into his bedroom. The room was as sparse and cold as the rest of the penthouse, dominated by a massive bed. He laid her down, his body partially covering hers. He didn't rush, he pulled back, his dark eyes searching hers in the dim light from the city. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with a raw emotion she had never heard. It was the first time she had been touched with care in years. Every brush of his lips, every movement of his hands was slow, measured, and full of a reverence that made her want to weep. He unbuttoned her shirt, his knuckles grazing her skin, and his gaze followed the movement, his eyes dark with a possessive fire that was both terrifying and thrilling. This was not a man taking something. This was a man worshipping. He touched her like he was memorizing her, the curve of her waist, the line of her hip, the frantic pulse at her throat. And when she touched him back, her small hands exploring the hard planes of his chest, tracing the scar over his ribs, she felt him shudder, a loss of that iron control that stole her breath. It was slow and intense and emotionally raw. It was a collision of two solitudes, a desperate, silent promise that for this one night, neither of them was alone. Alara woke to the cold gray light of morning. She was tangled in expensive sheets, her body aching in a dull, pleasant way. She felt seen. For the first time, truly seen. She turned. The other side of the bed was empty. She sat up, pulling the sheet around her. The silence of the room was heavy. She heard his voice, muffled, coming from his office down the hall. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold on the marble floor. She found his shirt from the night before, the one she had worn to breakfast what felt like a lifetime ago, and pulled it on. She padded quietly down the hall, drawn to his voice. He was on the phone, his back to the door, staring out the window. His voice was not the voice of the man who had held her last night. It was the boss. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying, his tone clipped. "The situation is escalating. The rivals are getting bold. No, she's not safe here anymore." Alara froze. "I'm moving her," Dante said. "The lake house. It's more secure. Completely off the grid. Prep the team. I want her gone by nightfall." Gone. Gone by nightfall. A cold, sickening dread washed over her. She felt discarded. Last night had been a distraction, a release, and now that she was a liability, he was moving her. Like a piece of furniture, like a problem to be managed. She backed away, silent as a ghost, her heart turning to ice. "You are not a possession." He had lied. She was exactly that, a possession he was moving to a different, more secure storage unit. She felt stupid. Used. All her pride, all her independence came rushing back, thick and bitter. She wouldn't be shipped off like baggage. She moved with frantic, silent purpose. She dressed in the new jeans and sweater, the ones she had hated. She found the cash she had managed to hide in her old apartment, tucked into her shoe. It was only $100, but it was hers. She looked at the phone he had given her, sitting on the counter, his number, her lifeline. She looked at it with contempt. She left it where it was. She knew the guard's routines. Marco took a coffee break at 9 in the morning, and the other guard, Leo, the irony was bitter, would watch the hall, but for 2 minutes, they switched positions. She didn't take the elevator. She took the service stairs, slipping into the concrete stairwell, her heart pounding. She ran down 50 flights of stairs, her legs burning, her lungs screaming. She burst out into the alley, into the morning light, into the smell of garbage and wet pavement. She was free. She walked, half running, back toward her old life. She didn't know where she was going, just away from him. She had to reclaim her life, what was left of it. She would find a new job, a new room, somewhere he couldn't find her. She was in her old neighborhood, the familiar, dilapidated buildings a stark contrast to the sterile luxury she'd left. She was walking past the bodega, her head down, when the van screeched to a halt beside her. Before she could even scream, a hand clamped over her mouth, just like in the alley. But this wasn't one man. It was 3. Well, a gravelly voice snarled in her ear. It wasn't the man Dante had killed. It was one of his crew. "Look what we found, the boss's little bird, out of her cage." She was dragged into the back of the van, the door slamming shut, plunging her into darkness. "He's going to pay a lot to get her back." Another voice laughed. "A whole lot." Back in the penthouse, Marco walked into the kitchen at 9:15. He saw the phone on the counter. He saw the empty bedroom, the unmade bed. He ran to the security room. The footage showed her entering the stairwell 8 minutes ago. He made the call, his hand shaking. Dante was in a meeting, staring down his rivals. When his private phone buzzed, he never took calls in meetings. He took this one and he listened, his face impassive. "What do you mean, gone?" Marco's voice was terrified. "She left. Boss, she took the stairs, left the phone, she's in the wind." Dante Russo went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The air in the boardroom dropped 20 degrees. He ended the call, rose from his chair, and looked at the men at the table. "This meeting is over," he said, his voice a whisper of ice. He walked out, dialing Marco back. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He spoke with a cold, absolute fury that was more terrifying than any explosion. "Find her," he ordered. "Put every man on the street. Check every camera in this city. I want her found." He paused, his voice dropping to a lethal promise. "Find her, or bodies will drop." The darkness smelled of wet earth and mildew. Alara's first sensation was the biting cold of a concrete floor seeping through her jeans. Her second was the sharp, hot pain in her wrists. She opened her eyes, but it barely made a difference. She was in a basement, a single, grime-caked bulb hanging from a wire, casting a sick yellow light. Her hands were tied behind a wooden chair, the ropes already chafing her skin raw. Her head throbbed, and she could taste the metallic tang of blood from a split lip. "She's awake." It was the gravelly voice from the van. The man, stocky, with a stained jacket and dead eyes, loomed over her. "Where am I?" Alara's voice was a rough croak, but she refused to let it tremble. "Your leverage, sweetheart," a second man said, this one skinnier, pacing nervously. "Russo's been a real problem for us, taking out our boss, messing with our operations, but he's got a weakness. Turns out, you." "I'm not his anything," she spat, pulling at the ropes. "Yeah, that's what we thought, too." Gravel voice chuckled, pulling up a rusted metal stool. "Right up until he sent our boss to sleep with the fishes. He doesn't do that for just anyone. You're special." He leaned in, his breath hot and sour. "Now, we're going to make a call, and you're going to scream, and he's going to give us back our territory." "Go to hell," Alara said, her voice low and steady. The man's eyes narrowed. "Defiant. I don't like defiant." He raised his hand, backhanding her across the face. Her head snapped to the side, the sting bringing tears to her eyes, but she didn't make a sound. She just turned her head back and stared at him, her gaze filled with a cold, pure hatred. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was furious. Furious at them, furious at Dante for pushing her away, furious at herself for being so stupid, so proud that she had walked right into this. "You made a mistake," she whispered, her split lip bleeding again. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Oh, I think we do," the man said, "and he's about to learn he can't protect everyone." Miles away, in a dark room that looked like a military command center, Dante Russo watched 3 different camera feeds at once. His rage was a cold, silent, suffocating thing. It filled the room, making his men jumpy and quiet. "Boss, we got her." Marco's voice was tense. A traffic camera picked up the van, license plate 2 blocks from her old apartment. It's a stolen plate, but we tracked it to a convenience store 2 hours before. Got a clear shot of the driver. It's Mickey the Rat Finelli, a low-level enforcer from AEG. This old crew. "Where is he?" Dante's voice was perfectly flat, devoid of all emotion. "We have an old contact, a junkie who owes Finelli money. He says Finelli and the remnants of that crew have been using an abandoned packaging plant down by the river. It's a fortress, but it's falling apart." "How many?" "Our contact says 4, maybe 5, including Finelli." Dante stood up. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, pulling a sleek black handgun from the holster at his back. He checked the magazine. Marco's eyes widened. "Boss, you can't. It's not protocol. Let my team go in. We'll handle it. It's too dangerous for you to be on the front line." Dante looked at him, and for the first time, Marco saw something other than the boss. He saw a man unhinged, a predator whose cage had been rattled. The cold calculation was gone, replaced by a white-hot, personal desperation. "She's in there because of me," Dante said, his voice a low growl. "They put their hands on her because they wanted me. This is not a business transaction. Marco, this is a retrieval." He slid the gun back into his holster. "Get the cars. We're going in, and we are not knocking." Alara heard the commotion first. shouting from upstairs, a heavy thud, like a door being kicked in. The sound of something muffled, like pops. The skinny man in the basement panicked, pulling his own gun. "What was that? I thought you said no one knew about this place." Gravel voice moved to the stairs, peering up into the darkness. "Shut up! It's probably just—" He never finished the sentence. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, and two quick, silence shots echoed in the concrete room. Gravel voice collapsed, his body tumbling down the steps. The skinny man screamed, raising his gun toward the stairs. "Who are you? Show yourself!" Alara pressed herself back against the chair, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it would break her ribs. The man who stepped out of the shadows was not the man she knew. Dante was a vision of controlled, elegant violence. His suit was immaculate, but his tie was gone, his top button undone. He held his gun with a steady, practiced ease, his arm never wavering. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. The skinny man fired, the shot deafening in the small space, the bullet whining off the concrete wall. Dante didn't flinch. He fired once. The man dropped. Silence. Dante stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his eyes, black and lethal, swept the room. They landed on her. He saw her, tied to the chair, her face bruised, her lips split, her clothes torn. He saw the ropes on her wrists, and he broke. The iron control that defined him, the cold mask of the boss, it didn't just crack, it shattered, disintegrating in an instant. The gun lowered to his side. The rage in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a profound, agonizing pain that took her breath away. He looked devastated. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy. He didn't say a word. He holstered his weapon, pulled a knife from his jacket, and knelt in front of her. His hands were shaking. His hands were shaking. He cut the ropes on her wrists, his movements quick but careful. The ropes fell away, leaving her skin raw and bleeding. "Dante," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't answer. He cut the ropes on her ankles. She tried to stand, but her legs were numb, buckling beneath her. She didn't fall. He was there, catching her, pulling her up and into him. He didn't just catch her, he enveloped her. One arm, hard as steel, wrapped around her back, and the other hand tangled in her hair, pulling her head to his chest. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. She felt a single, racking shudder go through his entire body. It was the only sign, other than his silence, that he was anything but stone. He just held her, breathing her in, his grip a desperate, crushing promise. He didn't let go. His men, Marco included, appeared at the top of the stairs, their own weapons drawn, but they stopped, frozen by the scene. Dante ignored them. He bent, sweeping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her up the stairs. He walked past his men, past the bodies, and out into the gray afternoon light, never once loosening his grip. He carried her all the way to the black SUV, got in the back with her, and barked at the driver. "Hospital, now." He didn't put her down. He just held her in his lap, his face a mask of stone, his eyes closed, his arms locked around her. Alara woke to the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The light was dim, the air sterile, smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. She was in a bed, a real one, with soft sheets. An IV was taped to the back of her hand. She turned her head. He was there, in the same chair he'd occupied in the penthouse, pulled right up to the bedside. He was still in his suit, now rumpled, a dark stain on the sleeve she didn't want to identify. His hair was messy, and a dark stubble covered his jaw. He hadn't slept. His dark eyes were fixed on her, raw and bloodshot. "You're awake," he said. His voice was gravel, thick with exhaustion. She tried to sit up, but her whole body ached, a deep, comprehensive soreness. My lip," she mumbled, touching it. It was swollen. Dante stood, and the exhaustion was instantly replaced by a sudden, simmering fury. He paced to the window, his back to her, his hands clenched at his sides. "What in God's name were you thinking?" His voice was low, but it vibrated with rage. Alara flinched. What were you thinking?" He spun around, his eyes blazing. Leaving, taking the stairs. walking right back into the one place on earth they would look for you. You left the phone. You left your protection. You could have been killed. Elara, do you have any idea, do you have any concept of what they would have done to you? His anger, so hot and sharp, ignited her own. The fear and pain in the basement were replaced by the memory of why she had run. What I was thinking, she shot back, pushing herself up on her elbows despite the pain. What about you? I heard you. Dante. On the phone. He stopped, his brow furrowing. What? I'm moving her. The lake house. Gone by nightfall, she recited, her voice trembling with a hurt that was deeper than any bruise. You were shipping me off. After last night. You were just going to discard me, like a package you didn't know what to do with. Discard you? He looked at her as if she were insane. That's what you thought? That I was discarding you? What else was I supposed to think? She cried, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. You pushed me away after you kissed me. You make love to me. And then the next morning, you're cold. You're the boss, and you're making plans to get rid of me. I am not a thing. Dante, I am not your possession to be locked away when I'm inconvenient. The accusation hung in the sterile air, loud and sharp. Dante stared at her, the fury draining from his face, replaced by a look of stunned realization. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once, then stopped. You're right, he said, his voice quiet. She stared, silenced by his agreement. He walked to the bed, his movements slow. He looked down at her, his expression raw, stripped of all his armor. You are not mine. He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight a heavy, warm presence. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense, blazing with an emotion she couldn't name. But you could be. The words, a low, possessive rumble, sent a shiver through her. Dante, That phone call, he interrupted, his voice dropping, forcing her to listen. My rivals are making a move, a real one. They're trying to start a war. And that phone call, I wasn't discarding you. I was trying to protect you. I was sending you to the safest place I own, a place they could never find. He looked down at his hands, his knuckles white. I was sending you away because I can't think when you're here. I can't run my world. I can't wage a war if I'm terrified every second that someone will find out about you, that they'll... He gestured to her face, to the bruise on her cheek, that they'll do this. He let out a breath, a harsh, unsteady sound. When Marco called, when he said you were gone, he looked up, and his eyes were unguarded, vulnerable. That was the first time in my adult life I have ever felt fear. Real, paralyzing fear. I lost my mind. I broke every rule I have ever made. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching. Stay, he whispered. The word was a plea. Don't stay in the penthouse. Don't stay under my protection. His gaze met hers, and it was a man, not a boss, who was speaking. Just stay in my life with me. Elara stared at him, her heart aching. This was him. This was the man behind the reputation. The man who was afraid. The man who had held her in the dark. And the man who had torn a building apart to find her. I don't know that man, she said, her voice barely audible. The one who's afraid. The one who's asking, not ordering. I don't either, he admitted, his voice rough. A long silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor. She made her decision. Show him to me, she said, her voice quiet but firm. If you can show me the man, and not just the boss, I'll stay. A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost pain, crossed his features. He nodded. A single, solemn movement. Okay. He finally reached out, his hand covering hers, his thumb gently stroking her skin. It wasn't the passionate, claiming touch of their night together. It was something else, something slower, deeper, and more fragile. His fingers then moved, with an infinite, heartbreaking gentleness, to her face. He traced the line of the bruise on her cheek, his touch feather-light, his expression one of pained regret. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his hand, a silent promise. The healing, the real reconnection, began right there, not with passion, but with a quiet, terrifying, and hopeful rebuilding of trust. The hospital room, with its sterile white walls and antiseptic smell, was the first cocoon. The penthouse, when he finally brought her back, was the second. But this time, it was different. He was different. Dante was showing her the man behind the reputation, as she had asked. It was a slow, sometimes awkward process. The boss, the man who moved men and mountains with a single, quiet order, was hesitant. He would sit with her in the evenings, not in the imposing armchair, but on the couch. He would talk. Not about his business, not at first, but about the city, about the books in his library, about the mediocre art on the walls that he clearly hated. He was letting her in, a week after she was released. He took her out, not to the shadows, but into the light. The restaurant was a place with white tablecloths so crisp they could cut, and waiters who moved with silent, practiced grace. The moment they walked in, a hush fell over the room. The maitre d', a man who looked like he'd been born in a tuxedo, hurried over, his face a mask of profound respect. "Mr. Russo, your table is ready." Dante's hand was a heavy, warm presence on the small of her back. He guided her through the room, and Alara felt the eyes, not the leering, hungry eyes of the diner, but eyes of fear, of curiosity, of deference. He was a king holding court, and she was, by his side, his chosen. He showed her how far his power reached. It was not just in the dark alleys. It was here, in the heart of the city's elite, in the way a senator at a corner table inclined his head, in the way the chef came out personally to discuss the menu. Later that night, back in the penthouse, the silence was comfortable. She had been tracing the lines on his palm, a simple, domestic act that felt revolutionary. Her fingers drifted, moving up his arm, over the hard muscle of his chest under his shirt. They stopped on a line, a puckered, silvery trail just above his ribs, the scar she had felt, but not truly seen. "Dante," she whispered, her fingers tracing its length. "What is this?" He stiffened. It was a fractional, almost imperceptible tensing of muscle, but she felt it. He looked down at her hand on his skin. He was quiet for so long. She thought he would deflect. "I was 17, he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "My father was dead. I was young, arrogant. I thought I knew how to run things. I trusted the wrong man." He covered her hand with his own, pressing her fingers flat against the scar. "He was my father's right hand, my mentor. He told me we were meeting a rival for a truce. He set me up. It was an ambush. He held me down himself while they did this." His thumb stroked the back of her hand. He was methodical. He wanted it to hurt. He wanted to teach me that loyalty was a fool's game. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice small. Dante's eyes met hers. They were dark, cold, and ancient. "It took me a year to recover. It took me another 2 to rebuild. On my 21st birthday, I invited him to dinner, right here in this building on the floor below." He paused. "I taught him that loyalty isn't a fool's game. It's the only game, and that betrayal has a price." He'd never been this vulnerable with her. He had shown her the scar on his body, and in telling the story, he had shown her the scar on his soul. She leaned in, not to kiss him, but to rest her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. He had confessed a brutal, defining moment, and she hadn't flinched. She just held him. Alara's restlessness returned, but it was no longer the frantic pacing of a caged animal. It was the energy of a woman who wanted to do. She couldn't just be his companion. She had to be his partner. She found her way into his office. It was immaculate, but the ledgers stacked on his desk were archaic. He still kept paper books. "You're going to laugh," she said one afternoon, holding one up. He looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "At the diner," she said. "I used to manage the books, all the tips, the payouts, the stock. It was small, but it had to be perfect, or we'd be short." She opened the ledger. "Whoever is doing this for you is lazy. He's rounding, he's costing you money." Dante looked at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It was the first time he had looked at her with genuine, professional respect. "Is that so? Let me show you." She said, "For a week, she worked. She started with the restaurant ledgers. Then he gave her more. And then, one day, he brought her a different set of books. They weren't black. They were blue. What are these?" "The other side of the business," he said quietly. She opened them. They weren't businesses. They were charities. A children's oncology ward at the city hospital, a community center in his old neighborhood, a network of anonymous scholarships. It was millions of dollars, all flowing out, all meticulously, if inefficiently, managed. "This," she said, her voice thick, "is you. It's just balancing," he said. Awkward, almost gruff, as if she had caught him in an act of weakness. "It's incredible," she whispered. She began to organize them. She streamlined the accounts. She found where the money was being wasted, redirecting it. She was no longer just being protected. She was his partner. She was managing his legacy, the part of him he kept hidden from the world. Their relationship shifted, settling into a new, profound intimacy. The romance now carried weight. It was in the small things. It was the deep, searing kiss he would press to her mouth when he came home, his hand cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, a silent, "I'm back." It was the way her hand found his across a dinner table, their fingers lacing together. One night, she was working late in his office, frustrated, a knot of numbers she couldn't untangle. He came in, not to talk, but to put on a record, a low, smoky jazz tune. He walked over to her, held out his hand. "Dante, I'm busy." "No, you're not," he said. He pulled her to her feet, into his arms. He held her close, one hand on her waist, the other holding hers, and slow danced her around the office, his chin resting on her hair. They didn't speak. They just moved together, high above the glittering city, a king and his queen in their fortress, partners. The formal gathering was a charity ball for the children's hospital she now helped manage. "I can't go to that," she said, horrified. "Dante, those people, You're just what?" he asked, his voice quiet. He walked into his closet and came out with a long, black garment bag. "You're my partner, Alara. You helped fund this. You're going." The dress was a custom creation. He must have had it made weeks ago. It was a deep, emerald green, the color of power and new life. It was heavy silk, clinging to her curves, with long sleeves and a daring, elegant cut that left her collarbones bare. When she was ready, she walked out into the living room. He was in a black tuxedo, a vision of dark, lethal power. He was adjusting his cufflinks. He looked up, and he stopped. His hands fell to his sides. He didn't breathe. His eyes, so often cold or calculating, were now a blazing inferno of raw possession, of pride, of sheer, unadulterated awe. He couldn't take his eyes off her. "Dante?" she whispered, her hands suddenly trembling. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He didn't touch her face. He didn't kiss her. His hands went to her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in the curve of her neck. "You," he murmured, his voice rough, "are going to be the death of me." He was right. She was the center of attention. When they walked in, his hand a permanent, possessive fixture on her back, the room buzzed. They knew the boss. They did not know the woman. They were getting champagne when a man approached. He was older, in his 60s, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, reptilian eyes. "Dante," the man said, his voice oily. "Good to see you supporting the community." His eyes slid to Alara, dismissing her in an instant. "And who is this? Your new charity case?" Alara stiffened. She recognized the malice. This was a probe, a test. She put a hand on Dante's arm. "Dante, let's go." She tried to pull him away, to de-escalate. Dante didn't move. He smiled. It was the smile she had seen in the penthouse, the one that meant danger. "Antonio," Dante said, his voice dangerously smooth. "This is Alara. She runs this foundation." He pulled her from his side, turning her slightly to face him, his hands gripping her waist. He was still smiling, but he raised his voice. Just enough for the surrounding tables to hear, the chatter in the room died. In fact, Dante continued, his voice cutting through the silence, let's be clear, so there are no misunderstandings. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the senators, the judges, the rivals. This woman now is with me. He let that sink in. She's not your concern. She's not your business. And she is not to be touched. His gaze locked back on Antonio, and all pretense of a smile was gone. Anyone who disrespects her will answer to me, personally. The silence was absolute. Antonio Bianchi's face went from pale to a deep, mottled red. He had been publicly dressed down, humiliated and threatened. He gave a stiff, jerky nod and disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the night. No one came near them without a smile, without addressing her first. Miss Alara, a wonderful event. Miss Alara, the work you're doing is remarkable. She was, in the eyes of his world, his. Later that night, the adrenaline of the confrontation still hummed in the air. The penthouse was silent. Alara stood by the window, her heart still hammering. She heard him come up behind her. He didn't speak. He just began to undress her. His hands were reverent. He found the zipper on the back of the emerald dress, his fingers a hot brand against her skin. He slid it down, slowly. The heavy silk pooled at her feet. He turned her around. She stood before him, clad only in a simple slip. He looked at her, his eyes dark, his face a mask of raw, tender emotion. Dante, she started. He was wrong, Dante said, his voice a rough whisper. You're not my charity case. You're my salvation. He cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. You belong here, he said, the words a vow. Not in this penthouse, not in this city. He leaned in, his forehead touching hers. Here, with me. He kissed her, and it was a promise. It was the sealing of the public declaration. It was slow and deep and full of a reverence that made her entire body tremble. He was telling her, without words, that she was his equal, his partner, his world. The danger, however, hadn't passed. It had solidified. 2 days later, Marco brought the news. Boss, it's Bianchi. He's declared war. He's using the gala. He's telling the other families you're compromised, that you're making emotional decisions. He's rallying them. Dante listened, his face carved from granite. He looked at Alara, who was standing by the desk, the charity ledgers in her hand, the old fear, the protective instinct roared to life. Marco, he said, get the lake house ready, full security detail. He turned to Alara. You're leaving, tonight. She looked at him. This was the test. This was the moment that defined everything that had changed between them. She calmly set the ledger down on his desk. She crossed her arms. No. He stared at her. Alara, this is not a discussion. It's a war. It's not safe. I know, she said, her voice quiet, but unbreakable. And I am not leaving. I am not that girl anymore. Dante, I'm not the one you ship off to a safe location. She walked around the desk until she was standing right in front of him. I'm your partner. You told me I belong with you. So, if you are planning for a war, you will talk to me. You will tell me the plan, and I will not run. The first bomb went off at 3:17 in the morning. It was not a subtle message. Antonio Bianchi had targeted Dante's largest warehouse on the south side, the one that managed all his legitimate shipping imports. The explosion was massive, a fireball that lit up the night sky, triggering a 7-alarm fire that burned for hours. It was a declaration of war, written in flames and smoke. Dante and Alara watched the news report on the massive screen in the penthouse, the orange glow of the fire reflecting in the dark windows. Alara's hand found his, her grip tight. He's not just testing you anymore. No, Dante said, his voice a low, cold calm. He's trying to burn me to the ground. He turned, his face a mask of stone. Marco, get the car. We're moving her to the lake house. Now. Dante, no. Alara stood, her stance defiant. We talked about this. I'm not running. This is not a discussion, he snapped, the boss replacing the man in an instant. The air in the room crackled with his authority. That, he pointed to the screen, was a statement. His next one will be personal. You are the only thing he knows I value. And what about you? She cried, her voice rising. You'll be here, in the city, while he's doing this. What if he... Dante, I can't sit by a lake and wait to find out if you're dead. He walked to her, gripping her shoulders. His eyes were not angry. They were desperate. Elara, listen to me. You are my partner. You manage my heart, but I manage this war. And I cannot do it if I am looking over my shoulder every second, terrified that you are in the crossfire. I can't think. I can't win. Your safety is the one non-negotiable term. He looked at her, his gaze softening, pleading. Go. Please. So I can do what I have to do. We'll have a secure line. You'll be safer there than I am here. She stared at him, at the iron control, at the fear warring beneath it. She hated it. She hated being the weakness, but she saw his logic. It was brutal, and it was true. Fine, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'll go. But Dante, if you die, if you leave me alone after all this... I'm not leaving you, he said, kissing her hard. A kiss that was a promise and a goodbye. I'm just clearing the board so I can end this. The lake house was beautiful. A fortress of wood and glass hidden deep in the mountains. 3 hours from the city. It was the safest place he owned. But to Elara, it was a prison. She spent 3 days pacing the floors, a secure satellite phone in her hand. Her only link. Dante retaliated. She heard the reports. A fire at one of Bianchi's shell corporations. A key shipment of his that disappeared from the docks. It was strategic. It was surgical. But it was distant. She was helping, in her way. She was on the phone with his accountants, moving money, liquidating assets, creating clean lines of credit. She was the partner, as promised, but she was a partner in exile. On the 4th night, the security breach happened. It was subtle. A flickering of the lights, the perimeter sensor on the south fence going dead for half a second. Elara, paranoid and wired, saw it on the monitor before the guards did. Marco, she yelled into the intercom. South fence! The power just cut! A moment later, her door burst open. It wasn't Marco. It was a man in black tactical gear. His face covered, he raised a silenced weapon. She screamed, throwing the heavy satellite phone at his head. It struck him in the face, and his shot went wide, shattering the glass window behind her. Marco was there, tackling the man from the side. 2 more men were coming up the hall. It was a full infiltration. Elara scrambled, crawling behind the heavy oak desk. She heard the sounds, muffled and brutal. The fight was over in seconds. Marco, breathing heavily, leaned over the desk. Are you hit? No, she whispered, shaking. They found me. It was an inside job, Marco said, his voice grim, checking his weapon. One of the new guards. Bianchi must have bought him. He grabbed her arm. We're not secure. We have to move. Now. They were halfway to the armored car in the garage when she stopped, ripping her arm from his grasp. No. Miss, this is not the time. No, she said, her voice ringing with a terrifying, final clarity. I'm done running. I'm done being the package you move from place to place. They found me here. They'll find me at the next place. There is no safe. There is only him. She ran back inside, ignoring his shouts, and grabbed the satellite phone. She dialed the only number it knew. Dante was in his war room. A map of the city spread before him. When the call came, he snatched it up. Elara, what is it? They found me. Dante. Her voice was calm, not a trace of panic, just cold, hard certainty. They got inside. A breach. Marco handled it, but they found me. He went rigid. I'm sending a helicopter. I'll move you to... No, she cut him off. I'm not going anywhere. I'm coming to you. You were wrong. I'm not your weakness. Dante, I'm your partner, and I'm done hiding. If I am going to die, I would rather be with you. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. She heard him take a single, ragged breath. Come home, he said. He brought her to the estate, a sprawling, old-world compound north of the city, built of granite and surrounded by a 10-foot wall. It was his family's seat of power, the real one. The penthouse was for business. This was for blood. The estate was under full lockdown. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Steel shutters, hidden in the walls, had been lowered, sealing the windows. It was a bunker. They were alone. Finally. In his private suite. The room was dark, the only light coming from a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace. The tension of the last week, the fear, the separation, it all hung in the air, thick and heavy. "This is it, isn't it?" she whispered, standing by the fire. "He's coming here." "He has to," Dante said. He was standing by the shuttered window, as if he could see through the steel. "I've choked his businesses. I've turned his allies. He has nothing left but rage. He'll make one last personal play." He turned to her. "Tomorrow." This was their final night. The air was charged with unspoken goodbyes, with the desperate, raw intimacy of two people on the precipice. She walked to him, her movements slow, deliberate. She undid his tie, pulling it free. Her fingers went to the buttons of his shirt, unfastening them one by one. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on her, his control absolute. "I was so scared," she whispered, her hand splaying across the hard, warm skin of his chest. "Not of them. Not of the man in the house. I was scared I would never see you again." "I told you," he said, his voice a rough gravel. "I'm not leaving you." "Promise me," she said, looking up, her eyes pleading. He didn't speak. He cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, and kissed her. It was not the reverent, tender kiss of their healing. It was desperate. It was raw. It was a claiming. A man pouring all his fear, all his rage, all his profound, aching love into one final act. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, her mouth never leaving his. He carried her to the bed, their clothes shedding in a trail on the floor. It was a slow, desperate collision. Every touch was a goodbye. Every kiss was a promise. It was tender, and it was rough. It was the frantic, beautiful act of two people trying to memorize each other, to burn themselves into the other's soul, just in case the dawn never came. Later, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, her fingers idly tracing the scar on his ribs. The fire had burned down to embers. "Dante," she said into the darkness, "I'm here. If anything happens tomorrow—" He tensed, his hand tightening in her hair. "Nothing will happen." "If it does," she insisted, "I need you to know. You saved me. You gave me a life. I'm not alone anymore. Even if... "Stop," he said, his voice thick. He sat up, pulling her with him. He reached over to the nightstand, to a small velvet box that had been sitting there, unopened. He took it. He opened it. Inside, on a bed of black velvet, was his ring, the heavy, gold signet ring he always wore. "This was my grandfather's," he said, his voice quiet, serious. "He gave it to my father, and he gave it to me. It's the only thing of value our family has ever had." He took her left hand. "If anything happens to me tomorrow, I want you to take my name. I've had the papers drawn up. They're in the safe. Everything I have, everything I am. It's yours. You won't be alone again. Elara, I swear it." He slipped the ring onto her thumb. It was massive, heavy. Tears streamed down her face. She looked at the ring, at the man who was offering her his entire world, his legacy, his name. She leaned in, her body shaking, and kissed him fiercely, a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, and a love so strong it hurt. She pulled back, her eyes blazing into his. "You better survive," she whispered, her voice a low, furious growl. "You better survive, or I'll kill you myself." The attack came just after dawn. It was brutal, strategic, and personal. Bianchi's men hit the gates with an armored truck, a full frontal assault. Dante was ready. His men were entrenched. The battle for the estate was a siege, a flurry of controlled, violent chaos. Dante was in the thick of it, not as a boss, but as a general, commanding his forces. But Bianchi was desperate. He had a second team. They came over the back wall, a small, elite squad. Their only target was the main house. Elara was in the safe room, a steel bunker beneath the library, with Marco. She was watching the cameras, her heart in her throat. She saw them. Marco, the terrace, they're inside. Dante, hearing it on his comm, roared, "Fall back! Defend the house!" He ran back, his gun in his hand, just as Antonio Bianchi kicked in the library door, two of his men behind him. "Russo!" Bianchi screamed, his face a mask of insane rage. "You took everything, now you watch her die!" He saw Ilara, who had emerged from the safe room, standing behind Marco. Bianchi raised his gun. "No!" Dante yelled, firing, diving across the room. It was a blur of noise, shouting and explosions. Ilara screamed. When the smoke cleared, Bianchi and his men were down. Marco was leaning against the wall, a wound in his leg, but alive. And Dante was on the floor, lying in a spreading pool of blood, his eyes closed. Weeks later, the first sound he heard was the beep. Steady, rhythmic. He knew that sound. Hospital. He opened his eyes. The light was blinding. He tried to move, and a fire of pure agony shot through his chest. "Dante?" He turned his head. The movement was agonizing. She was there. Ilara was asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of his bed, her hand clutching his. She looked thin, exhausted, her face pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't left. She was wearing his ring, not on her thumb. On the fourth finger of her left hand, held in place by a smaller, simpler gold band. He squeezed her hand. Her head shot up, her eyes wide, wild. "Dante? Oh my God, Dante!" She jumped up, her hands fluttering to his face, his arm. You're awake!" "Hey," he rasped, his throat raw. She was crying, silent, grateful tears streaming down her face. You've been asleep for 3 weeks. They said you died on the table. Twice." He looked at her hand, at the ring. "You did it," she nodded, wiping her face. I found the papers in the safe. I had your lawyer file them." She held up her hand. "I took your name." He looked at her, at his wife, his partner. "The estate," he whispered. "Damaged," she said, "but not broken. The library it's a mess, but the foundation is strong." She smiled, a wobbly, exhausted smile. "Marco is fine. He's complaining about the food." He closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. He had won. They made it official, not with a wedding, but with a promise. There in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, he was still weak, but his voice was firm. He held her hand, the one with his ring. "You have me," he whispered, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Forever." 6 months later, the estate was rebuilt. The new library was filled with sunlight. The stone was clean, the scars of the battle gone. Dante, his arm still in a sling but his strength returned, stood by the new French doors, looking out over the grounds. He was no longer just a boss. He was a husband. He heard her footsteps. Ilara came up behind him, sliding her arms around his waist, resting her head on his good shoulder. She was no longer the grieving, terrified server. She was Ilara Russo. She was strong, she was safe. They stood there, hand in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She was no longer alone, and neither was he. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed it. This is a passionate community, and I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to Mafia Romance Stories for more. Your thoughts mean everything, so please share them in English. We read every one.